Well, we've touched on net zero transition in earlier conversations today, and this session takes that conversation a little bit deeper by looking at what energy opportunities are emerging alongside new technologies. So as investors focus on the future, what could the market look like in 10 years' time? So your speakers for this discussion, if I can ask you to come up as I say your name, Zoe Witten, Managing Director, Head of Impact at Pollination; Monique Miller, Chief Investment Officer, Renewables and Sustainable Finance, Clean Energy Finance Corporation; Guy Debelle, former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Advisor to the Investment Committee of Australian Retirement Trust and a Non-Executive Director at TVAN; and Karina Nolan, Executive Director, Original Power, Co-Chair, First Nations Clean Energy Network. And your moderator for this session, Ed John, Executive Manager, Engagement at ACSI. Please welcome your panel.
Thank you, Ali, and thanks for the wonderful chairing throughout the day. And good to see people are well caffeinated and sugared in the afternoon break. So we promise this will not be the graveyard shift. This will be the energising shift. And I think before this session, and as we were discussing this session, I think we all agreed that as far as the Australian economy and the Australian investment community, we're pretty good at talking about the issues and the problems we have as far as the energy transition. And we're often long on issues, but a little bit short on solutions. So today's panel is really looking beyond, raising our sights, thinking of that 10-year view and some of the projects that are getting these experts in their fields excited as far as the energy transition is concerned. And I think we heard it today on the directors panel. The capital is available for these projects, but actually the availability of high quality opportunities is still far too small if we're going to meet Australia's 2030 goals and certainly beyond. And it was quite sobering, I think, to read research today that actually investment in new large-scale renewable energy capacity fell by 80% last year. And the issues are very common to all of us. Things like bottlenecks in the grid, the lack of or slow planning processes, slow environmental approvals, policy certainty and cost. So we know these issues well, but again, today's panel is going to shake us out of that doom and gloom, and we're going to get into solutions mode and think about the emerging energy opportunities. And to kick us off, Monique, I might start with you, given how much your day job is focused on this. How are you thinking about these opportunities that lie ahead?
Sure. So I have spent my whole career in a world full of challenges, right back from 2001 when the government introduced a target which was 2% renewable energy in the grid for within a period. We're now at the point where we're 40%. So at every step along that way, the journey has been hard. At every step, it did seem impossible. I'm an optimist, particularly having sat in some of the prior sessions and learned about the types of applications in the energy sector that artificial intelligence is generating. But right now, we are at a real turning point in Australia. We have more clarity on the policy that will drive the renewable energy and the storage that needs to be delivered to get us to 82% renewables by 2030. We have an opportunity for investors in this room, so superannuation and others that perhaps have not been able to invest as much as they would have liked to because of the relative risk return in Australia versus other jurisdictions, for them to come to the table and ideally end up with a framework that can justify the types of investment that's required. To put it in scope, I think the government's new capacity investment scheme is estimated to have an investment opportunity of $67 billion. Every year it would require about 40% more investment than we've ever had in the renewable energy market in Australia. It will stretch banks, it will stretch the incumbent independent power producers, it will stretch the retailers. It is an enormous challenge, an enormous opportunity, but I think we're at the stage where we can see what the policy is, and it's up to people in this room to engage with government and with other stakeholders to work through the engineering challenge, which I think is really the remaining challenge.
No, thanks, Monique, and we'll pick up that engineering challenge and and why those are stretch targets in many ways. And Zoe, sorry, you're a long way away over there, but if I can bring you in, you're working with companies, you're working with investors domestically as well as a lot of offshore investors. How are you viewing this opportunity in the near term?
It's a good question, and interestingly, following Monique's comments, it's almost a question an answer which in some cases has evolved without the CIS and before the CIS. So I think CIS will change it. But let me talk about it as the present environment. I think some of these are quite durable. We see a few really big opportunities emerging, and I do just want to emphasise, and then I will put it down, the electrification opportunity. I know a lot of you in this room have been talking about that for what feels like a decade now. It is old but gold. And the reason I highlight it as an opportunity is because we are starting to see it in a lot of the work we do with companies where they'll say, I wish I could do a thing, but that thing would require access to electricity and certain types of electricity that I don't have. So there's still an opportunity to unlock a lot of latent decarb activity across the system with that electrification question and that clean electrification question, even if it feels like something we've been talking about forever. So I just want to keep that there and emphasise it. But let me talk about some of the opportunities that sit beyond the grid. Obviously, one of the things that comes up more and more for us is the export opportunity. You guys have all had to sit through way too many superpower conversations, so I won't go too far into that. But safe to say there's this extraordinary opportunity unfolding in Asia, particularly for clean energy exports, that allow them to solve their transition challenges. We've been talking about that here for a very long time, but we're starting to see that bite. And the way we're starting to see that bite is on the other side of most of the transactions we see, energy transactions, there's an Asian counterpart. So there's this, we were looking at our national hydrogen strategy update the other day, we're looking at the export targets, and then a few days later talking to some of the Asian CEOs, and they are, particularly in East Asia, looking at export demand that is multiples higher than what we're presently anticipating. So there is a really big ask there. That's not a simple ask because it has a production footprint here, and I'm sure we might get into that. But that's a space that we have known is coming for a long time, but we're now seeing the money and we're now seeing the demand blocks starting to move to really make that true. There's a really big vertical integration opportunity. I think as a lot of the corporates have come to step into their transition exercises, actually try to source the energy, try to source the commodities, they're starting to understand that maybe access isn't as easy as they thought it would be. And also, as they've come to understand a transition landscape, they have much better strategic intuition about what opportunities that presents and how they can lean into them themselves. So we're starting to see that vertical integration into energy demand in corporates, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit. And I know Karina's going to speak to this a little bit, and Guy probably will as well. There really is a growing First Nations partnership opportunity. So the First Nations voice, the First Nations, I don't want to say presence, but the presence and the visibility of the First Nations partners in our national debate has got stronger and stronger across the last decade, including in the way that we develop our new industrial assets and develop our energy supply chains. And there is a really significant partnership opportunity there to work with those communities and bring those communities into the production conversation and into the transition answer. So I think we'll get a chance to unpack a few of those, but those are some of the angles of opportunity we're seeing.
A bit to unpack there, but perfect time to move across and actually bring you into the conversation, Karina, because I think often as investors, sometimes we can get stuck in those silos of E, S and G, but clearly E will never work without S and without community buy-in. You obviously work with Indigenous communities right across Australia on these issues. How are you viewing the opportunities and risks?
Yeah, there is a lot of work going on. I firstly just want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Kulin Nations, and I think, as we all know, this transition has to be done, really quickly. A lot of our communities are already experiencing extreme climate change, and actually the ability to stay on country is impacted by that. But also our communities, not just ours, but all of ours, need to be central to the transition. And I think sometimes we can leave people out of this conversation. So one of the opportunities we've been talking about three kind of areas of work, is making sure there's genuine consent and genuine benefits for our communities. If there's 10,000 kilometres of transmission line, let alone the large-scale export projects, our mob must be really bought in at those early stages. I think for you in the room, that, the more stable those early negotiations are, the better the design designed the projects are. We're talking about 70-year-long projects. That de-risks, it makes the investment more stable. You're going to get better agreements and better benefits and just actually better kind of projects that last. And, you know, I think the other opportunity around making sure that our communities can actually keep the lights on. You know, people might have heard me talk about this before, but we're up around 3 million households that have rooftop solar. Not very many of those are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households. So while we're doing the large-scale piece of work, we also need to make sure that we're keeping the basic kind of energy supply clean, accessible and affordable. And I think the third piece that we've been looking at a lot is making sure our mob are not just responding to proponents coming onto country. And yes, there's some best practice that we'll probably talk about what that might look like. But what will it take for the traditional owner capacity and aspirations to be lifted and built, solid governance, so we're actually the proponents of some of those projects on our own country as well. So there's a range of areas to unpack there, but I think there's enormous opportunity, but we need to reset those relationships, and I think we need to make sure communities aren't bought in 5 years' time. And that means, you know, even things like the capacity investment scheme, we're working closely with the government to look at what would it look like to have an equity, you know, percentage of First Nations equity built into this next round of auctions, not just merit criteria and kind of, you know, jobs, but actually really right through all aspects.
Yeah, on so many occasions, companies come after the project has happened and say, what's the problem? And that sort of proactive versus there's reactive element is so critical. Guy, just to bring you in here, again, you're an investment committee advisor, you're wearing a few hats in this. I'm just interested in how, you know, again, looking across that span, you see these sort of bucket of opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I would pick up, I think there's two things to separate. There's the domestic and then there's the export opportunities to talk about. And they sound separate, but actually they are pretty linked in the sense that in both cases, by and large, you need more green electrons. So unless you have the green electrons, you can, it's a bit like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz. You can't just keep on saying Kansas and you end up there, or clicking your shoes together. So you can't just say green energy superpower and one day we'll wake up and merrily it's happened. We actually have to do stuff to get there, and we have to deploy capital, we have to engage with First Nations to get there. So that's one point, and that's true across both the domestic and the export opportunity. But they both need green electrons. Once we've got more green electrons, then we've got the luxury of thinking about what we might actually want to do with that. But in both cases, and pick up on something that both of you two said, it sort of comes down to having a confidence around your customer offtake. Right, and that's true both on the Asian side and it's true on the domestic generation side. And I think it's interesting, picking up what Zoe said, is that there are a bunch of companies now who are starting to look at, oh, well, I actually need green energy to get this project off the ground, but I can't find that. But then if you talk to all the green energy providers, they say, well, I've got these great projects, but I'm having trouble locking anyone in on any decent long-term contract, and the banks, and of course not super funds, but just the banks, won't give me any credit if it's just merchant, if it's just, I need a long-term contract there. And so there's that disconnect at the moment there. Whereas on the export side, as Zoe said, and to be more specific, Japan and Korea, and actually switch that around, Korea and Japan, because that's that demand is there, and that's more where demand is really trying to generate the supply, I think. And there's a lot of capital coming and a lot of interest in joint ventures coming out of Korea and Japan, where there's the opportunity for Australian capital to come alongside that. And that looks actually, to some extent, more certain, and that's a huge opportunity. And why is that an opportunity? And one of the things which isn't appreciated is, so yep, we've got this great renewable energy generation potential, but the other thing that we have, which Japan and Korea in particular don't have, is land to deploy that energy on, while noting that we have to talk to the owners of that land to engage on that, but that's an asset we have that they don't. And then comes the question of, well, how do we ship that green electron to Korea and Japan? So in what form do we do that? Maybe not a cable between here and Japan, although some people think that's possible. But it's probably, and that's where we think about the opportunities a bit further downstream, the vertical integration that Zoe was talking about. So they're the opportunities. It's not, but none of those opportunities get anywhere unless we have more generation in the first place.
We have to do some doing. That's
Yeah,
important to
and
hear.
do something, not just talk about it.
I'll come back to the question of scale and attracting capital to the projects, but I am keen to sort of bring us out of the clouds into the sort of here and now, and particularly on the project side. And maybe, Corinne, if I start with you, the sort of projects you're seeing, maybe best practice hasn't started, but what are some of the projects you're sort of excited about or interested in that people should know about in this room?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably worth starting by saying, we've been working with the Canadians for the last couple of years, who are probably 10, 15 years ahead of us, our counterparts, Indigenous Clean Energy over there. So they've got over 200 First Nations, either solely owned or joint venture projects. In Australia, we don't have one that's yet off the ground. I know there's a number. So there's around 14 in Australia that are in the works in different stages. And one of those is kind of a really large scale, and then the other ones are much smaller, sort of 16 houses to a microgrid in Borroloola that we've been working on. But you can just get a sense of the scale. So I think we've got a lot of work to do to invest in communities, if you're talking about best practice in terms of First Nations led and owned projects. So there's still a lot of work to do there, but we're getting there. And that also goes to sort of relevant finance, changing the system of grants and loans in this country. It's very difficult for communities to actually access the finance that I think others can, even through ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We've been working with people around what those guidelines could look like to encourage First Nations ownership. But then on the other side, I think that best practice does look like that early engagement, free, prior and informed consent. We talk to communities and say, we've actually written a number of guides specifically for community, and then we've done the guide with the Clean Energy Council, which is the best practice guidelines. But actually for communities, you don't get to the negotiations table until stage 10. So there's all of this work that needs to happen for people to get their house in order, to get their governance organised. When people have good, clear decision-making processes, we make good decisions and then they stick. It's unfortunate we can't actually point to really projects in Australia we can go, that is absolutely how it should be done, because we're still early stages. Yeah.
Well, there's 14 in the works. If we're here in 6 months' time or a year's time, we might start to see some of that cutting through.
Yeah, and I really think that means that some risks might need to be taken in investing in projects that don't have all of the perfect ingredients. And I think the other thing is that there is still some really deep racism around money in this country, and I think there's a lack of trust sometimes in our capacity as traditional owners to run and manage our own organisations. So there needs to be some capacity built, but also I think there needs to be some trust, and I think this goes to the resetting of the relationships on all sides, that actually investing in some of those early stage projects. There's a whole bunch of risky projects in this industry. I'm sure I'm not telling anyone in this room that's news. So I think take the risk in investing in some of our early projects too.
In that partnership model rather than a transaction mindset. Zoe, maybe if I go to you, I know Pollination's done a lot of work on projects in the East Kimberley that people may not know about in this room.
Totally. I mean, to layer off what Karina's saying, we've currently got a lot of people will know this, and for those of you who've had Martine speak it to you, apologies that you're hearing it twice. We have a green hydrogen to ammonia export project which is under development in the East Kimberley. As far as the composition of the project itself goes, probably not super different from a lot of the stuff that some people in this room would be used to hearing about and thinking about. But what is different about it is the ownership structure. To Karina's point, it is we are the developers. The ownership model is the Aboriginal Clean Energy Partnership. It's a number of First Nations landholding groups who are co-owners of the project. So to Karina's earlier comment, they have equity in the exercise from the beginning. That is facing up into that demand that we see in Asia, the export demand. It has, Guy highlighted the challenge of needing to produce the green electrons, so that's a whole exercise that sits alongside that, and it is real. But it is one of those projects that's in the formulation of the green electrons are right there, it's not on the grid, they go straight into the facility and then straight out of the port. We'll talk a little bit about, probably later, about why that's a model that's developed there and why we see that happening quite a bit. But a few notes to the importance of the partnership. It is, to your earlier comment about E and S, it is a partnership and a project that ends up partially being a community solution. But to Karina's earlier point, it also becomes faster to do and hopefully more durable, because you have the partnership of the traditional owners with you doing that work. Interestingly, we have been approached by others to do the same types of partnerships, including offshore. So this is an Australian-specific set of needs, but they are a set of needs that are represented in other jurisdictions around the world. And so we are presently working in a couple of other jurisdictions on similar projects, which I obviously can't talk about. I wanted to comment on the trust piece. Going through even the early financing conversations for that project, the racism is real, which is fun, but the trust is starting to come. And I think, to Karina's point, the exercise of having a number of those projects starting to be in system and being visible means that it's not just one or two incidences that finance providers are interfacing with these types of projects on. They're starting to see them more regularly. And I think that's slowly starting to shift the headspace about what is the risk you're taking with this new set of partners, and how do we think about those partners and how do we credential them. So we're very hopeful, especially given the volume of interest that we've had in that exercise, that we will see that trust from the finance providers and actually from others, including government, starting to lift over time. And we see a really significant opportunity to the points that we made before. Aside from the electrification challenge on grid, a really big opportunity to work with those types of partnerships to develop models like that allow us to face up into that transition need in Asia specifically, answer some of those problems outside of some of the challenging parts of electrification and the energy opportunity that I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more, but to do so in a way that gives you allows you to touch a number of different communities and a number of different stakeholders in doing that. And I hope that kind of is one of the pathways that can help us get faster to not just clicking our heels together and saying green energy superpower over and over again, to use Guy's point.
And when will it come into production? Some of these projects are so long-lived.
They necessarily are long-lived because they're huge development projects. So we're talking, and I'm going to get this wrong, I think it's 4 years. But if Rob was here, he'd chastise me for that and tell me a slightly different number because it tends to move as the feasibility goes along. But it's not something that's going to come into production next year, basically. It's a bit of an exercise, particularly when you're having to stand up multiple pieces of infrastructure at once.
Thanks, Zoe. And Monique, again, you occupy a role that many in the audience do of having... I'm sorry, Karina, that's the take a minute. You occupy a role that many do in the audience of actually trying to deploy capital, looking for kind of investments that work economically as well as tune into some of these trends. What are the projects that you're excited about, you think people need to know about happening today?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. So yeah, as an investor, I guess I'm within my own business kind of looking at the near-term opportunities, but I have to say what we're seeing as near-term opportunities were hypothetically 10 years away only 3 years ago. So the sector for me that's moving the most quickly is battery storage, shorter and medium duration battery storage. It's just astounding. It was only, I think, 2017, there was the tweet between billionaires in Australia that kicked off what was the world's largest battery at the time, 50 megawatts. We're now seeing batteries built at 10, 20 times that size. We're seeing proof of concept of what those batteries can contribute to the grid in terms of balancing out the various parameters that the grid needs to operate within a very narrow range across a very enormous distance to keep the lights on. And it's really interesting seeing the grants programs which are proving different use cases for those batteries and then taking the market operators and state governments, I guess, on a journey as to how these things can be used in the overall security package. And it's just astounding. We're coming from a world where 3-4 years ago, not one battery was considered to be built in the NEM, and in the next 50 years, and then suddenly we are just seeing them explode. So although we had a very challenging, not explode, thermal runaway events do happen.
Increase.
That was not what I meant, for clarity. Increase significantly. But yeah, we've had a very challenging year in quarter in renewables for all the reasons you set out. But I think the battery storage has been the leader, and so it'd be very interesting to see how that continues to play out.
I guess to put the question a different way, what would be the largest project you've seen
The largest? Well, I mean, one of the standouts just recently is the Waratah Super Battery, which is 850 megawatt hour battery located in the Hunter Valley. It's very rare that you get a significant piece of new energy infrastructure so close to a major city, so that's kind of been exciting. It's on the site of an old decommissioned coal-fired power station next to a gas-fired power station, so you can stand on the site and see the whole history of the energy transition. And so that is designed to basically as a standby battery, so that it can. The grid authorities can have the comfort to open up transmission capacity around the grid and incorporate all of the new renewables that's been built out elsewhere in New South Wales. So
And do you find when you see something like that, do you then expect, hey, will they get 5 more of these, or this will scale up, or this is a sign of things to come, or do you hear about one and then back to the office, hear about another a year later?
Well, I mean, even back early, the people that were working on and are delivering those batteries all thought it was pie in the sky only 2 years ago, right? And so now there's so many other people working on similar scale opportunities. And I used to run the solar business, and solar competes with rooftop. It's got challenging economics. It's not necessarily great to have a massive oversupply of solar in the grid, to have a massive lot of computers that you can reprogram to provide grid services. If there is a short-term kind of optimism in the market and an oversupply, I think that will get eaten up in grid services over time.
Yep. And Guy, I know in the Northern Territory, some really interesting work on critical minerals happening and other projects.
Yeah.
What do you want to put on people's radar?
Yeah, I mean, they've got some direct exposure for that through Taiwan, which is both in the East Kimberley and in the NT, the mines in the East Kimberley, and then processing plant, potentially the mines in the East Kimberley, that's where the minerals are at least, and the processing plant is in Middle Arm. So everything is not gas in Middle Arm. And partly picking up what Karina said, I mean, we've tried at Taiwan to have a direct, we've really gone out of our way to have the direct engagement with traditional owners in both places right from the beginning. The Kimberley Land Council in East Kimberley, and then Larrakia in particular in Middle Arm. Larrakia have got their own energy corporation, which we're engaging with an MOU with. So, there is great opportunity, and that comes to the point about it makes more sense economically, by and large, rather than to just dig and ship, is to dig, process somewhat. The question is, how far is the somewhat? How far down the value chain you go, and then ship from an export potential. But it also creates, and I think Middle Arm possibly is a good example of this. We'll have to see how this plays out, where you have the potential of green energy combined with the potential, we're looking at vanadium, which goes into large, sort of Darwin-sized batteries, put it that way. And so you've got the potential to do that onto a grid the size of Darwin, but you're bringing together a whole bunch of different participants in effectively a renewable energy zone, although I don't think that one's been quite designated as such yet. But that's where there's a great opportunity to work across collaboratively across companies with the traditional owners, with the local, in this case the Northern NT government, to create a great opportunity with potentially then an export opportunity at the end of it. And that's good from a emissions point of view in terms of doing the processing using green energy. That's a great start. That's an opportunity we have which other parts of the world potentially don't have. But also means, if you just stick with the mining side of things, rather than shipping a whole bunch of rocks around the world, most of which people don't actually want to use, you only ship them the bits that they do want to use, which turns out surprisingly involves a lot less ships. So, which reduces the emissions footprint as well. So, there's some great opportunities where also we as Australians are capturing the value add in Australia. That doesn't mean, and iron ore is probably the large scale example of this in terms of how far down the green iron path do we go. We're sitting here in Victoria. I'm from South Australia originally. Probably not going back to having a car manufacturing business back in the country anytime soon. But but we can go further down that value chain than just exporting the iron ore out of the country, and at the very least go to green iron, maybe green steel. That's much more open question, but certainly the former. And that's taking advantage of a whole bunch of different, endowments or comparative advantage that Australia has.
No, definitely. And if we just reflect, we've talked about the huge opportunity if we think 2050 and we think about the trillions needed to invest. We've reflected on some of the current projects where it's still at that small scale. I guess some thoughts from panellists, and Zoe, might start with you on this, but what those barriers are, or that question of how do these things scale up in the coming years. So some barriers and how to leap the barriers.
Yeah. I'm impressed that we're having a moment to talk about barriers in our panel about opportunities. It's a good two-step you've done to flip that around there.
That's right. You can skip straight to the second if you like.
No, I love barriers. Don't stop me from talking about barriers. I'll pick up on a few of the things that have come out in the discussion so far because they're worth drawing out here. There is the demand coordination piece is across a value chain is quite real. And I think that's one of I'll talk to that in a moment, but I think it's one of the reasons that we're seeing things develop in the formats that they're presently developing in. Guy mentioned earlier that you have lots and lots of situations where you have a company standing on one side going, God, I wish we had this clean energy. And a clean energy developer on the other side going, I wish we had an off-taker, no one wants it. We see that over and over and over and over again. It's not just the case for clean energy, it is the case for transition materials more broadly. So green commodities, materials, the whole shooting match. We're starting to see people overcome that, and we'll probably talk about how, but that's one that just comes up over and over again. I'd also note at-risk financing. Now, I don't mean to pull this up to browbeat people, because I know that often in this context we say, oh gosh, I wish Australian investors would spend more money at risk on these things. There's a reason people don't, right? It's because the governance and risk controls around the Australian investment system, particularly the superannuation system, are strong and high, and therefore those are not the type of entities that you see putting capital at risk for this. Nonetheless, what we do see is that most of the financing is presently coming from offshore. I should note that I'm also talking about debt here. So it's Australian banks who are also not providing this at-risk financing. And that means that I think a lot of project proponents and companies have started to get the drift. And so they're going offshore for financing. That's fine. It just means that the Australian sector is missing out. So we have lots and lots of conversations with people where they say, we'd love to get more exposure to this. We know it's really important. But then actually trying to get access to that exposure when you have got counterparties in Japan, in Qatar, in Canada, who've got higher risk appetite is quite difficult within the existing risk and governance framework. As an example, we did a transaction last year, which took us 4 months to raise in Australia. It's a long time for one of our counterparties. The same counterparty would like to do another transaction. At the moment, I think it'll probably take us 3 weeks and a handful of meetings because the counterparty is Japanese this time. And we see them, as I said earlier, on the other side of almost every transaction. So the level of it is an interesting situation we're in, wherein we have a couple of really large blended finance institutions, state institutions that have been playing in this space for a while and are good at the early stage and blended risk piece. A bunch of foreign institutions who are willing to put capital down on the fact that this is a goer, and a really, really big and very interested capital sector in Australia that is almost absent in the conversation. Yep. So that's another barrier that I just want to throw in.
Perhaps and I'll talk about... Just quickly jump on there, because Guy, you're in the investment committee superannuation room. Fair assessment on risk appetite and who's going to be invested in these first projects?
I'd separate risk appetite. Sorry, the risk appetite around the investment committee table from some of the barriers that Zoe was talking to. So the question is whether you would like to do it, but having... we're working through that at ART at the moment, and hopefully Nicole Bradford's in the room and her team's working on it right now, is actually how do we deploy capital directly into this? And this is not over the next... this is to have an answer by the middle of the year, not have an answer in 5 years' time. And it is to try and address how can we get our heads around that? Where do we fit that? It's, you know, we should be patient capital, and so the horizon should match, and we should be able to take. So I'm not even sure it's necessarily risk appetite. It's just getting comfortable with the returns over the horizon. So I'm hopeful that, you know, again, this time, you know, you keep on saying where we'll be this time next year or 2 years, whatever. This time next year, actually, that would be a different conversation.
That's useful. It's a real-time comparison. But again, yeah. Zoe, I think your broader point there, you're getting to that opportunity side.
I will.
Sorry,
I was going to say that the one other thing I'm just going to put on the floor and then leave it there, because we've all talked about it too much, is transmission and approvals. I think when we talk about solutions, where we see things happening at the moment, and I hear this in a couple of examples today, but also in examples where we see this moving, are often places where the people are getting around those barriers. So they're often on an asset or beside an asset or on a brownfield opportunity. They're often vertically integrated within someone's supply chain or value chain, so they don't have to do the demand-supply negotiation dance. And they're often where offshore demand and finance come together. So we're seeing more and more situations where you've got financing out of Korea or Japan and demand out of Korea or Japan coming in one block, often with the same trading house on the other side, and saying, cool, we'll take that, out we go. And those are not necessarily solutions, fundamental solutions to those problems. But I think that and I hope that what Guy says is true, and that we are having a very different conversation in 18 months about the appetite to go in earlier and go in along some of these projects from the Australian financial sector. But they are adaptations, I think, that we see people using to try and get these things going, to try and access the opportunity, to try and get projects across the line.
And Karina, if I can talk to that, because I think in your introduction you pointed to that sort of lack of scale, that sort of 14 projects versus Canada that's already at 200, and it's you know, part of that conversation. How do you see us getting to 200 or beyond and scaling up?
Yeah, I mean, I think this picks up the finance conversation, because I think, you know, we're seeing our communities be, again, wildly disadvantaged in this sector. So, you know, hydrogen got $2 billion from the government. There'll be a handful of projects that might get the go-ahead from that. There was $2 million in there for First Nations engagement. We've had a talk with them about those figures. Doesn't really add up. But if you think about what we're doing at the moment with the current financing and the current arrangements, even from government, and that's why we've been working with them on a First Nations clean energy strategy, but we are basically replicating the inequities of how our communities have dealt with mining in the past. You know, critical minerals is just mining. It's not necessarily different to any other mining. You know, it's not necessarily fossil fuel mining, but we've got a lot of work to do, I think, to reset the way that people engage, proponents engage with our community. So if we want to get to scale of First Nations-led projects, so we need to build that capacity, which I spoke about before. But there's also, I think, a range of incentives that the government, I mean, this is what the Canadians have done, is they've worked closely to incentivise proponents that are doing best practice with First Nations, you know, which means then we're going to see better projects and better developments and help us get there quicker. And I understand there's issues around finance and what, you know, bringing in international capital and all those sorts of things. But I guess from our side, we're not even at some of those tables, and what we're doing, you know, is prioritising kind of investing in business, I think, rather than some of that community capacity. So from our end, I think there's a lot of work to do with that.
Yeah, a lot of work, but a lot of opportunities too. Yeah. Just a few of the audience questions. Might be a bit of a lightning round here to fire them out. And the first one could be a hot potato, perhaps not. Guy, I might throw to you for this one quickly. Isn't nuclear power renewable? Please talk to us about the role that nuclear fusion energy can play in the transition.
So I can answer the question, including from the ASFI taxonomy point of view, which we haven't mentioned yet, but and we're using the scenario which we're using, which is the climate works scenario based on the IEA broader scenarios, has no role for nuclear in 2050 as of today. So I suppose the way I'd answer the question, I've had to answer this question a number of times in the last few weeks, is, I mean, if someone solved the science tomorrow, then, you know, sort of happy days, but we haven't solved it, as best as I can tell, for the last 75 years. That's on fusion. And then on the fission side of things, you know, and the reason why the IEA doesn't have it in there is not because the technology doesn't exist, because it's so damn expensive. at the moment. And we've got real world examples right now, often in a lot of the countries which are cited as the best examples of this, where the costs are just blowing out and the time to build is blowing out. That's the other point, particularly in Australia, is if we just flipped our mindset today and said, great, let bring on nuclear, then we'll be lucky if we have something on the ground by 2040, which is challenging in trying to make, that's not going to do anything between now and then. So you can put aside whatever ideological point of view you have, but then if you just come down to the straight financials of it, it don't stack up at the moment.
No, that's a good.
And I suppose the only other thing I'd say, and this is relevant for the taxonomy more broadly, is so if the technology changes, then
the opinion changes.
Then well, I would say, so I would use the Keynes's old, when the facts change, I change my mind. To my mind, the facts haven't changed. And so I haven't changed my mind. That doesn't mean my mind won't change, but the facts need to change, not just the rhetoric.
The next question, again, Monique, I might throw this one to you, but the companies often raise a lack of demand for future fuels carbon solutions. How do you get past the supply versus demand wrestle in the transition? And I think we've hinted at already of that, if you build it, they will come aspect.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think primarily, I think I mentioned before, part of the reason that traditional investors have struggled to invest as much capital as they would like in Australia is because of lack of offtake. I think matching up that supply and demand and the quality and calibre of offtake that companies need for whatever purposes they're using it for. So there's a whole range of reasons companies might enter into an offtake agreement. It could be purely for greening their product. It could be for actually hedging their energy risk, in which case they need some type of firming, or it could be under a legal compliance obligation. And now we've got this fourth model emerging, which is a government underwritten floor, I suppose, which is the case in both New South Wales and the Commonwealth Government. And both of those are trying to then encourage off-takers to come in after them and recontract over the top. So effectively give a minimum feasible case for investment to build a project, and then to allow time to match the right type of off-taker with the right type of project. And it could be when you go to the bigger off-takers, we heard from BHP and Rio earlier, those types of off-takers need a whole big portfolio, and they're rolling off energy contracts at different times, and it's not that easy for them to go and contract individual projects. And so I think this is an opportunity to get that timing element sorted in a way that we haven't had before.
I'll just jump in there. I agree with everything Monique said. I think there is a challenge, and certainly saw it when I was at Fortescue in the hydrogen space. There is, in a bunch of cases, the green product costs more than the black product. And that's often then, I think, pejoratively labelled as the green premium rather than it's actually the black discount, because you're not pricing the carbon externality in the fossil fuel version of it. And that challenge is real, particularly for a new product like a hydrogen, and so we can't wish that one away. And for commercial reasons, people do have hard time getting their heads around paying more for a product. And then the question is, well, if we can't move down the cost curve unless we start actually doing stuff. So there is, in some spaces, not all, but there in some spaces there is that is absolutely a real issue, and that's where I think slightly some of it is actually other parts of the world are more ahead than us in being willing to pay for that. I think the only other thing I'd throw into the mix is if you look at what's potentially going to come out of Europe with the CBAM, and you've got any external facing part of your business, and you work your way up the value, if they're demanding the product has to be green, then actually that's going to guarantee you someone who's willing to pay that, to pay, as I said, I don't want to call it a premium, but to pay that price.
I can see Zoe's dying to come in with something here.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this there is a real opportunity. We're talking a lot about projects and singular businesses here. There is an opportunity for the investors in the room who have listed portfolios in this, which is that one of the things that makes all of this easier is demand, right, and offtake. At the moment, we ask a lot of the companies that we have coverage of to have Scope 3 targets, and that ostensibly gives you a demand footprint for some of these things. It's called Go Get Green Steel, it's called Go Get Green Hydrogen, Get Green Energy. It's in your scope 2, depending on where you get it, but could be in your scope 3. At the moment, that request is pretty fuzzy in some senses. I don't mean to discount people's work there, because I know it's a hard request to put forward still. But there's a subset of that which is about demand for green energy and for green commodities. And if you stand that demand up, then you make this whole conversation about finance and risk and getting the thing done quickly much, much, much easier. When we interviewed directors for the AICD climate survey that we just published a couple of weeks ago, one of the things a lot of the ASX directors said to us was, we know we need to buy this stuff. It is more expensive in a number of situations, and we don't feel like we have the backing of our investors to actually put more money on the table and incur more cost in the short term to get these things to scale and to get these transition industries up and running. And that is a dance that we're doing, that we're caught in, with our investors on one side asking for transition, and on the other side asking for us to control costs and asking us to really produce results. So investors here who do have interface into listed space can have quite significant impact by specifying the ask for those procurement, those demand targets. That really, really helps you stand up the models that then make a lot of the conversation about getting projects from 14 projects to 200 projects a lot easier.
So we're at the sort of the year 9 formal of one half of the room, one other half of the room, and we're waiting for 1 and 2 to start dancing to get that happening. A couple of questions here, and I'll add them together. Just on the just transition and how communities sort of define their roles is there, but an added question about any examples of how the energy transition can create good jobs, and also throw in there if you have examples of bad experiences and where it doesn't work. Karina, any thoughts around just transition and jobs?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things we've been talking to communities who are nearby to large-scale projects, which we understand they're still in their design phase. Some of them are still working out the exact footprint, but some of them are proposing to export power past the communities that need it the most. So obviously that needs to be dealt with. That communities that are dealing with 40-degree temperatures and sharing a room that's air conditioned and unacceptable kind of conditions. So let's work out how we make sure that export power can also, I'm not saying plug it in, but actually that same company can resource local communities. But at the same time, looking at what the local jobs look like around some of those large-scale projects. At the moment, the most of them are proposing to FIFO people in from the East Coast or other places rather than building that workforce, which is going to take at least 2 or 3 years. So we've been doing a lot of work with unions around what that looks like and building that capacity now, but it requires a bit of forward planning, I think, and that's the bit that is sometimes missing. People are just sort of, I think not being that considered about what local workforce development looks like. And we also know it's necessary and it's going to be cheaper for some of the regions as well.
Anyone else want to come in on that jobs and good jobs question?
I'd only comment on that at the moment, one of the things we're obviously trying to do, there's the production of new jobs and good jobs, to Karina's point, that have got that right access, the right distribution. We're obviously also trying to go through an exercise of preserving jobs where they presently are. I don't mean to sound too protective about that or rear-facing, but we are trying in a bunch of regions to say, you've got a region that presently has a set of activities. How do you keep people in that, not displace people in those regions? One of the big challenges in getting that done, in a lot of cases, there are some advantages there. The brownfield piece I mentioned earlier is one of the advantages, but one of the challenges that continues to come up to getting that done is the demand thing and this supply chain coordination thing. And we have many governments working on that, state and federal level, and actively working on that. But really the people who need to bring the money to the table are the companies who need to stand up the new facilities in those hubs. And so again, I would just echo, it's really boring, and it's also the thing no one wants to touch. But coming back to the demand piece, producing demand in the right place and using, whether it's policy signals or whether it's the actions of the companies in question that are in the value chain to produce demand in the right place, that's going to be part of enabling us to not just transition into a new energy system that's in a completely different place and strands a whole bunch of people. So that's a regional overlay to that question of demand creation, which obviously has to have a government involved with it, but also turns off a lot of the companies that are core counterparties and investees to people in the room.
So it's at the same place, same time, and the right policy settings to actually have it happen.
But it's not just the policy settings. People
Yes.
go to the policy and are like, the government needs to do that. It's not just the government.
No, that's right. More, it's a shared responsibility or shared challenge. Question here, which I think picks up on the earlier comments, but it says solutions like solar and EVs are getting cheaper, which is great for the transition, but bad for margins, especially for many sort of Western listed companies. So that question of why invest, I mean, we've seen that recently in a lot of the results presentations where companies are, making new investments. There's almost always a sell-side question about will this dilute, return on capital in the near term. And I mean, Monique, you've looked at this issue. Your thoughts around that and how we sort of change our perceptions, or is it just literally when they become higher margin that we change the conversation?
I suppose, solar panels and EVs getting cheaper, I guess no one's manufacturing them in Australia, so it's not their margin being eroded.
Yes,
but and overall, I think it's a benefit for the economy that we have some of the cheapest rooftop installers in the world. In fact, the margins in that industry are incredibly fine to the extent that it's very difficult to get batteries on the home wall because you can't. Installers won't go and visit a house twice to give a more complex sales story. They'll only visit once. EVs are becoming more and more affordable for the majority, and the exciting thing to me about EVs is you have your wall battery driving around on the road, and then you can plug it in at your place of work and at your home, and that can be part of the overall once the regulatory impediments are sorted out, that can be part of the overall transition journey. I think the point about margin erosion through investing in clean energy generally, I guess we are seeing that, for example, with the big energy majors that are moving from a world where they, very high risk, very high return world to a lower risk, lower return investment case in renewables. And I think they are having to manage that, and presumably their shareholders are having to manage that journey. But it is about the externality of the cost, and it will get internalised over time, particularly as some of the big purchasing countries send that externality through the
CBAM
adjustments.
or that sort of pricing happens.
At least in part, it's designed to address that particular example of, to put a downside cap on your margin.
That's right.
And I know, Guy, you recently wrote a paper about this. You don't have to read it out, but I guess there is that perception about existing energy grids not requiring any investment, and renewable always being more expensive, and to give people the 10-second takeaway on that.
I think, well, you actually did it yourself, Ed, which is you threw out this number, all the trillions that we need to invest. It's like, but when it comes to energy, we were already going to have to spend, in this case, probably somewhere in the order of $400 billion, even if we didn't go anywhere near renewables at all, because those coal-fired power stations, up in the Troy Valley or whatever, they're reaching end of life. That's got nothing to do with the green energy transition. That's got to do with an asset reaching end of life. It's called depreciation. And so then we say, oh well, we're doing it all in a renewable space, and that costs so much money. The answer is, well, it may be, and that's debatable whether it even costs more, but we're going to have to spend a large amount anyway, and so given that we have to do that, let's do it in a sustainable way, and rather than not. And so it isn't expensive in and of itself. Replacing an whole energy system is expensive, regardless of what you want to do, and that's where we're at. And that's not a well, it is a choice of sorts, but that's a reality.
And just in the time we have available, which is very, very short, I did want to take us, again, we've been doing the 10-year view, the long-term in the clouds in some of this conversation, but perhaps to leave the audience from each panellist, just one thing you think in the short term could actually make a difference on these issues. So starting with you, Karina.
Oh, look, I think our communities have been talking about this as an economic development opportunity. A lot of us have felt like we've been pushed into a corner with some of the choices about how we can, if we choose to, use our country and self-determine what happens on our lands and waters. And I think if we get in front of this, and even though this industry is, well and truly underway, but it's a moment in time, I think that we can really reset how that business is done in our country and make sure we can benefit. So we're excited about that possibility.
And Guy?
Taking account of everything Corinna just said, but I would just say expedite power approvals for power generation, and then that opens up any number of opportunities.
For me, it's right down to the micro that the most responsible thing you can do as a consumer, as a company, to facilitate higher penetration of renewables is participate in rapid demand response. Turn your aircon up a couple degrees when the system is under stress. Don't charge your EV at 6 p.m. All those types of activities, they will mitigate the cost that needs to be borne for this transition, which might not be good news for the investors in the room, but it will be good news for the those of us that pay energy bills.
Sorry.
I would say for those in the room, engage on demand, engage on procurement. It makes a lot of these other problems go away, actually, or makes them a lot easier to bear, except for the approvals problem. And I'm really keen to see those models that we talked about today that people have built, finding their way around some of these barriers, start to be replicated and scaled. So I know that's from the conversation we've had that's going to happen, but I would be excited to have the conversation again in 12 months and see whether it's hit the road.
I think that's a great point to end on, and thanks on behalf of our audience, thanks to all the panellists for your insights, and we look forward to tackling these challenges and finding the opportunities together. So thank you to our panellists.